to name a few. Twin relationships, social attitudes and mental abilities, 2003 to 2005. Outside a shopping mall, 38-year-old Marty and Stephanie stared at each other in a bewildered daze, touching each other's faces and hair as if they were their own. After several minutes, they joined hands, jumping up and down with glee. 34-year-old Jim and Trent exited their cars on a stretch of Texas highway. They approached one another slowly, shook hands, asked the other simultaneously how they were after all these years, then started laughing. Reunited identical triplets Bob, Dave, and Eddie met one another on 2 occasions when they were just 19, first Bob and Eddie, then Dave and Bob and Eddie. They described their moments of meeting as ecstatic shock. 1. I have videotapes of the first reunions between the twins Marty and Stephanie, Jim and Trent, and several other sets. I never tire of watching these tapes or hearing their stories. The first jubilant moment when the twins recognize each other is overwhelming. Reunions of separated twins have also grabbed public attention because they appeal to the deep-seated sense that family members belong together. What people call the twin bond, identical twins, extraordinary understanding, intimacy, and rapport, most likely comes from the twins' perceptions of their matched abilities, personalities, and temperaments. This view comes from studies of reared-together twins, set within different theoretical perspectives, and based on twins of varied ages and gender. These studies consistently show closer MZ than DZ twin relationships, as would be predicted from MZ twins' greater physical and behavioral resemblance. Such findings have begun to affect decisions about separating young adopted twins, compensating a twin for a CO twin's wrongful death, and even deciding if identical twins' identical test scores reflect independent efforts or cheating. The 3 early MZ twin studies did not systematically assess the nature and quality of the twins' evolving relationships. The investigators did, however, append wonderfully descriptive accounts of the twins' life histories to their quantitative findings, some of which included information about the twins' relationships. They did this because they were intrigued by the human interest aspects of their cases as well as by the science. Newman et al. Claimed that their 19 pairs would provide writers with plenty of material for good stories. According to Newman et al., MZ twins Edith and Faye, age 37, had become very fond of each other and enjoyed impersonating each other. Betty and Ruth, age 12, were interrupted while dancing on a tabletop in one of the examination rooms. In all these high-spirited performances, Ruth seemed to be the leader, but Betty was entirely cooperative. Shields' twins Madeline and Lillian, age 36, bought themselves identical dresses when they next met, as if they wanted to make up now for the pleasures of twinship which had been denied them. 7 Joel Nielsen's twins Pal and Peter, age 22, said, "We saw something very familiar in each other, and this familiarity was almost weird." 8. 40 of the 54 early MZ twin pairs for whom social relationship information was available grew close to one another after meeting. This was evidenced by their frequent contact following reunion, satisfaction with their relationship, and other factors. Twins from 14 of these early MZ pairs did not become close, and information was vague or missing for the remaining 22 sets. But the finding that nearly 75% of the pairs had bonded closely indicates that the length of shared time does not necessarily decide how twins' relationships progress. Unfortunately, comparable information on DZA twin pairs was unavailable. Twin Relationship Survey. It was apparent to the MR researchers that meeting a twin was a significant, life-changing event for our participants, regardless of their zygosity. Most twins were adoptees and were delighted to hear new details about their biological family, and to acquire in-laws, nieces, and nephews about whom they had not known. They were also excited to learn more about their medical life histories. My graduate studies, which combined twin research and evolutionary psychology, convinced me that a formal study of MZ and DZ twins' social relatedness would be meaningful, on both theoretical and practical levels. Aside from testing the hypothesis that MZ twins would show closer social relations than DZ twins, the findings could help us and the twins understand their feelings with regard to meeting and being with one another. The hours spent with the Minnesota twins were great opportunities to watch their relationships unfold. The Imza twins generally showed a better fit than the Dizay twins, as if they had known one another all their lives. Their common understandings and shared laughter came more easily for them than for the Dizay twins, revealing a greater sense of we. But it was important to systematically record and analyze these observations to give them scientific significance. When I arrived in Minnesota in 1982, I asked Bouchard if a protocol was in place to capture the twins' relations with one another. He said there wasn't, but he encouraged me to create one. The result was our 52-page twin relationship survey. First administered in 1983, the survey appeared initially as a thick stack of green and white fanfold computer paper, then acquired a leaner look as a spiral, bound booklet with a pink cover. The number of questions grew after the first few administrations because the twins volunteered information on topics we had yet to consider, such as how the twins' adoptive siblings felt about the newly found twin. The survey's final version contained sections on the twins' rearing family situations, satisfaction in the rearing home, search for biological relatives, and meetings with the twin. Some twins completed this survey during their follow-up visits, and several answered it by mail. Most twins genuinely enjoyed this part of the study because it connected meaningfully to why they were participating in the project. They loved learning about their similarities and differences on the behavioral and medical tests, but their relationship with their twin touched them on a deeper level. The Twin Relationship Survey posed two key questions concerning the closeness and familiarity that twins felt toward their CO twin. Each question was answered with reference to the time of their first meeting, recalled, and the time of their study participation, current, for a total of 4 questions. Their answers ranged from 1, greater than best friends, to 6, less than someone I meet for the first time. Twins also answered 2 questions with reference to the current closeness and current familiarity they felt toward any unrelated siblings with whom they were raised. This set of questions was one of the most informative features of the study. Bouchard grumbled about how much file drawer space the survey consumed, so I understood his delight when he finally mailed them to me in California. The surveys now occupy considerable space in my laboratory, but I am grateful for the volume of information we collected because I have used these data many times. In 2003, 20 years after creating the Twin Relationship Survey, I wrote the paper I'd always wanted to write, a study of social closeness and familiarity between reunited twins. The analysis used data from 44 Imza twin pairs, 33 Dizay twin pairs, and 7 individual twins. Based on Hamilton's inclusive fitness theory, reviewed in Chapter 9, I expected the Imza twins to express significantly greater closeness and familiarity than the Dizay twins, and they did. The current ratings for both Imza and Dizay twins exceeded their initial ratings, probably because the twins had had a chance to be together and become closer and more familiar over time. The twins' closeness scores exceeded their familiarity scores, both when they met and currently, but the familiarity that they felt for one another also increased with time. The twins' answers were anticipated, but fascinating still. The differences in ratings between the Imza and Dizay pairs were greatest at the highest levels of closeness and familiarity. That is closer, more familiar than a best friend. Furthermore, the proportion of Dizay twins endorsing the highest level of current closeness at the time of testing was less than the proportion of Imza twins endorsing the highest level of initial closeness at the time of reunion. Some Dizay twins took longer to achieve the high level of closeness that many Imza twins experienced almost immediately. It is unlikely that this was because the reunited Imza and Dizay twins had different expectations about how they would get along. Aside from researchers, many people place importance on twinship rather than on twin type. That is, they equate twinness with sameness or closeness, but this view will not make Dizay twins alike or socially close. The 4 social relatedness measures showed negligible or slight associations with the 6 contact measures, for example, days before separation or total contact time, except for 2 small but statistically significant correlations. Current familiarity showed a 0.16 correlation with days before separation, but the relationship between them was in a counterintuitive direction. That is, more time together was associated with reduced familiarity. Time from reunion to assessment showed a 0.21 correlation with current closeness, indicating that twins studied soon after their first meeting were closer than those studied later. However, many factors, for example, the twins' work responsibilities and our work obligations, affected the scheduling, thereby reducing the meaningfulness of this finding. A wealth of information lies in the simple contrasts between people who vary in genetic and environmental relatedness. Comparing the social closeness between full siblings and half-siblings, or between half-siblings and step-siblings, can say something about whether genetic relatedness plays a role. The reared apart twins, unrelated siblings, were true research treasures in this regard. It turned out that the twins' current closeness and familiarity ratings were higher for the CO twins they had recently met than for the adoptive siblings they had always known. These results were more striking than the twin comparisons because they were not what logic would suggest. It makes more sense for lifelong siblings to be closer than reared apart twins meeting for the first time, but the data held a different message, one that agreed with evolutionary predictions. The next step was to figure out the reasons behind the IMSA-DISA twin differences in social relatedness. It was expected that similarities in the twins' personality traits, interests, values, or education would be tied to their social relatedness, but that was not the case. Perhaps the twins' perceptions of their similarities, rather than their objectively measured self-reported traits, triggered the levels of connectedness they expressed. A 1991 study showing that relatives' perceived personality similarity predicted the degree of support and conflict between them affirms this possibility. My former University of Chicago thesis advisor, the late Daniel G. Friedman, put it best when he suggested that recognition of common features may foster a sense of we between ourselves and our fellow tribesmen. Recognition of this sense triggers a series of emotions whose net effect is tribal unity and the increased chance for altruism. 13. Since the MISTRA ended, my colleagues, including Bouchard, refer newly reunited reared apart twins directly to me. University of Minnesota psychology professor Mike Miller put me in touch with Nina, a 24-year-old Korean-born MZ female twin raised in the United States. Nina met her twin sister for the first time in Seoul at age 21. I heard the details of their reunion at Between, a trendy restaurant in the Itaewon section of Seoul, when I visited South Korea in 2010. The twins' first meeting occurred in a taxi cab that took the twins from the university campus to the train station. The American twin, who was taking classes, first had to spot the cab that carried her sister. En route to their birth city of Busan, the Korean-raised twin indicated that she wanted to hold her sister's hand and then cuddle together while they fell asleep. The American-born twin said that while it would be strange to cuddle with someone she'd met for the first time, it felt normal and natural with her twin. This fascinating remark beautifully captured our fundamental human tendency for social closeness with someone like us. I wish I could have worked it into the survey. Personality and the family environment. Many MISTRA's later analyses built upon earlier ones. By 2003, links between the articles examining the twins' responses on the family environment scale were apparent. In 1990, Bouchard and McGew found that genetic factors had a modest effect on the recollection of family cohesion, how much family members were concerned, committed, and helpful toward each other. They also showed that about 25% of the variance in consensuality in adulthood, how much a person sees the world as others see it, as measured by the California Psychological Inventory, could be explained by cohesion or conflict, openly expressed anger, in the childhood home. More consensual adults came from more cohesive homes. In 1995, Herr and Bouchard, using an enlarged reared-apart twin sample, found significant genetic influence on memories of family cohesion. 0.35 based on the Fahrenheit-4, based on the Block Environmental Questionnaire. However, they found relatively little genetic influence on the recall of organization, importance of structure and planning, or cultural orientation, level of political, intellectual, and cultural activities in the childhood home. Then, in 2003, Kruger, Marcon, and Bouchard tested the idea that personality heritability might explain the heritability of recalled family environments. That is, maybe happier people are more likely to remember pleasant than unpleasant childhood events. Since the family environments of reared-apart twins are not shared, this study also let them see if the CO twins' different family environments, the non-shared variants in this case, explained their current personality differences. Beginning with psychologist David Rowe's 1981 twin studies, a recurrent and provocative behavioral genetic finding was that recollections of the family environment are under partial genetic control. The difficulty was that no one knew how these recollections were influenced. Kruger wanted to figure this out. He used a range of environmental measures, that is, the family environment scale, Minnesota Briggs History Record, Block Environmental Questionnaire, and Physical Facilities Questionnaire, and organized the scores into two factors: status, socioeconomic and intellectual, cultural status, and cohesion versus conflict in the rearing home. The personality measures were the three multidimensional personality questionnaire higher-order factors: positive emotionality, negative emotionality, and constraint. Data were available for 52 MISA twin pairs and 38 DZA twin pairs. As expected, genetic influences on family environment measures were explained by genetic influences on personality traits. For example, genetic influence on constraint, emotional control, and on lack of negative emotionality, not feeling aggressive or alienated, explained 40% and 60% of the genetic effects on recalled cohesion, respectively. Thus, genetic factors predisposing people to control their emotions and to lack negativity are the same genetic factors that lead them to recall, or believe they recall, a cohesive childhood family environment. Kruger also found that positive emotionality explained 100% of the genetic effects on status, childhood family standing. That is, genetic factors underlying positive emotions predispose people to recall family environments as having been high in socioeconomic, intellectual, and cultural status. Kruger's other key result was that the CO twins' differing perceptions of their family environments had little impact on current personality differences between them. In other words, if one MISA twin recalled a low-conflict home and his or her co-twin recalled a high-conflict home, these different perceptions were not associated with the twins' differences in emotionality. But the twins' personalities were not exactly alike, so their differences had to come from events that they did not share. I was intrigued by Kruger's proposal that there may be a personality set point, analogous to Likken's happiness set point discussed previously. If so, minor daily events, such as catching a bus or losing a bet, might cause temporary fluctuations around people's characteristic positivity, negativity, and constraint levels. Perhaps we caught some twins on a day when such minor events had occurred. I liked this study because of its simple design and sophisticated reasoning. It is also one of Kruger's favorites. Kruger also included an insightful discussion of the objective and subjective elements of the twins' answers. This discussion was necessary for making sense of how heritable personality traits could explain heritable family recollections. Answers to personality and rearing questionnaires reflect both subjectivity and objectivity. However, if the twins' responses were more subjective, then perhaps their personalities affected the way they recalled their childhood homes. Happy, upbeat twins might have focused on pleasant events, whereas sad, depressed twins might have remembered the bad times. Alternatively, if the twins' answers were more objective, they might have actively influenced the nature of their rearing homes. Twin peacemakers might have promoted congenial home atmospheres, whereas twin troublemakers might have created conflict. Kruger's was an earnest attempt to uncover links between different genetically influenced behaviors. Further attempts at constructively replicating his findings are hopefully forthcoming. More recent to this writing, Kruger is focused on how unusual circumstances in people's lives can impact genetic and environmental effects on personality. Reports of either very high or very low parental conflict by adolescent reared-together twins showed that their positive emotions were affected by their shared environment. This finding is important, but it must be reconciled with findings of personality resemblance in some of the adult reared-apart twins who were raised in especially different and unusual circumstances. Active genotype environment correlation. The seeking out of environments compatible with inherited characteristics probably best explains the twins' matched personality traits. Resiliency, in particular, explains why MZA twin Roger Brooks, who bounced around from home to home, showed the same sunny personality as his twin brother Tony Malassi, who was raised in a warm Italian family. According to Kruger, the biggest behavioral mysteries are posed by MZA twins such as Gene and Joan, both of whom took music lessons. The twin who had received less family pressure to perform turned professional, but the opposite outcome was also possible. Understanding why and how rearing circumstances produce one result over another remains a true challenge. Social attitudes, conservatism, and more. Irving Gottesman celebrated his retirement with a Festschrift held at the University of Minnesota in June 2001. The resulting 2004 volume, edited by Gottesman's former student Elizabeth F.D. Lala, included a chapter by Bouchard summarizing the mistress' findings on social attitudes. On the topic of authoritarianism, he reminded readers, although we were pushed into the domain of genetic influence on attitudes by Martin et al.'s 1986 work with the W.P. Wilson-Patterson Conservatism Scale. The first attitude-like questionnaire on which we published data was the Multi-Dimensional Personality Questionnaires Traditionalism Scale, 20. Our 1988 personality study reported an MZA correlation of 0.53 for traditionalism, based on 44 MZA twin pairs. A 2003 paper and the 2004 Festschrift chapter updates showed a remarkably stable figure, 0.52, based on 74 MZA twin pairs, with the latest MZT correlation based on a study of 626 sets equal to 0.61.22. The numbers reflected substantial genetic influence on traditionalism. In fact, the updated mean MZA correlations for the multi-dimensional personality questionnaires 11 personality scales and 3 higher-order factors, 0.46 and 0.50, closely matched those based on the 626 MZT twin pairs, 0.46 and 0.52. In addition, the estimated mean heritabilities from the RE-R Together study, 0.44 and 0.49, were extremely consistent with the MZA intraclass correlations which directly estimate heritability. The data on traditionalism and the other personality scales proved to be important to the analyses of the Wilson-Patterson Conservatism Scale. The Wilson-Patterson Scale was brought into the study in 1986. Bouchard also added Altemeyer's right-wing authoritarianism scale to the assessment at that time, but for some reason the authoritarianism data were analyzed first. Bouchard said he was a moron not to have included such inventories in the first place. At that time, the few attitudinal studies based mostly on young twins showed little genetic influence on social attitudes, so researchers, including Bouchard, were not motivated to pursue this domain. Martin et al.'s 1986 twin study on the topic left him no choice. The reared-apart twins completed the same 28-item version of the conservatism scale as the Virginia Commonwealth University twins, not the 50-item version used by Martin et al. The briefer form allowed comparisons between MZA and MZT twins, and was better suited to our crowded assessment schedule. The findings were published in December 27, 2003 with an update in Bouchard's 2004 chapter. The conservatism scale captured a significant and distinct attitudinal dimension, conservatism. This was shown by the high correlations of conservatism with Altemeyer's right-wing authoritarianism scale, 0.72, and Telegin's traditionalism scale, 0.58, based on 338 reared-apart twin and non-twin participants. At the same time, the Wilson-Patterson showed low correlations, 0.16 to 0.17, with the multi-dimensional personality questionnaires' other personality scales, such as absorption and alienation. It also showed a low negative correlation with the IQ scores, 0.23. The fact that both the personality scales and IQ scores were not strongly correlated with conservatism showed that the conservatism scale had discriminant validity. That is, that it was measuring a behavior that differed from both personality and intelligence. Bouchard also found that childhood rearing measures were unrelated to conservatism among twins who had been adopted, with importance of religion to the mother being the only exception. Point 2. However, the similarity in this measure between CO twins was minimal, and any resemblance between them did not affect their resemblance in conservatism. It is exciting when new findings replicate existing ones. That is because there is a sense that the real answer is at hand, replicating Martin's heritability 0.62 and the Virginia Group's findings for conservatism. Heritability 0.65 for males and 0.45 for females was important because most people believe that this attitude came mostly from the rearing family environment. Finding that the MZA and DZA conservatism correlations were 0.59 and 0.21 respectively, and that the genetic estimates ranged from 0.56 to 0.59 were significant breakthroughs. A successful constructive replication had been completed, but there was more to come. In 2004, Bouchard revisited the Wilson-Patterson scale by organizing its 28 items into 3 factors we labeled sexual conservatism, social conservatism, and militarism, as well as a total conservatism score based on all 28 items. Again, it was found that total conservatism correlated highly with traditionalism, 0.60, but not with the other multidimensional personality questionnaire scales. As expected, the 3 factors and total score correlated highly with right-wing authoritarianism, 0.62, 0.42, 0.51, and 0.73 respectively. These findings demonstrated convergent validity among the measures. The scales that should theoretically be related to one another were related. The 3 factors and total score also showed the expected lack of correlation with general intelligence, 0.21 to 0.14. These findings showed discriminant validity among the measures. The scales that should theoretically be unrelated to one another were unrelated. The 4 MZA intraclass correlations, 0.51 to 0.62, exceeded the 4 DZI intraclass correlations, 0.05 to 0.35, consistent with genetic influence on the specific factors comprising conservative attitudes. However, the near-zero DZA correlation, 0.05, for militarism was a surprise low that was hard to explain. The only corroborating evidence available were the low DZT, 0.23, and full sibling, 0.20, correlations for militarism in the Virginia study. Militarism could conceivably be an emergenic trait, influenced by unique gene combinations. If so, it would not be unusual to see Army volunteers and conscientious objectors within the same family. The within-study replication was important because it confirmed conservatism as a distinct social attitude, but did so in a new way by means of the 3 factors and a total conservatism score. This work also showed the benefit of having direct access to both the twins' data and to their life histories. The findings gave scientific meaning to the twins' experiences, downgrading the explanations based on coincidence or fabrication that some critics had claimed. The fireman twins, Mark and Jerry, were completely against women serving as volunteer firefighters. The Giggle twins, Barbara and Daphne, who were so talkative on most issues, were totally uninterested in politics and fell silent when the topic came up. The British twins, Irene and Jeanette, both crossed out tolerate and replaced it with respect on a questionnaire item concerning other people's religions. These glimpses into the twins' minds often came about casually over lunches and coffee breaks, and we made notes of these observations. Bouchard thought it was best to avoid controversial topics with the twins to keep the atmosphere congenial. Bouchard's 2004 chapter also provided updated results for religiosity. The Mistras within study replications and those of other investigators showed that the genetic influence on religiosity stayed at about 0.50. The widespread belief that religiosity in adulthood was a product of family rearing during childhood was under revision. The idea that social attitudes are partly shaped by genetic factors is still hard for some people to accept. This is probably because parents and children are seen together at religious institutions, social activities, and community events. It makes intuitive sense that children's social attitudes should be shaped by those of their parents. In fact, the MISTRA found that among intact biological families, the moral religious orientation and intrinsic religiosity were substantially correlated, 0.53. Again, because biological parents and their children share both genes and environments, these causal factors cannot be separated. Adoptive parents and children who share no genes in common provide informative tests of relationships between family background and religiosity. The 1999 study of religious behavior reported a negligible relationship between moral religious emphasis in the childhood home and intrinsic religiosity during adulthood, 0.10, among the adopted twins. Children grow up and draw conclusions of their own, filtering information through their own personalities, perceptions, and experiences. The Virginia group found only age-related differences in conservatism until the young reared-together twins turned 20. As young adults, these twins could express their own views more freely, allowing their genetic tendencies to emerge. That is, children usually follow their parents' religious practices until they are old enough to form their own beliefs and act on them. Laura Koenig, one of Bouchard's dissertation students, and the only one to study only reared-together twins, showed the same effect. She did not find a genetic influence on retrospective religiousness, religious activities, and interests adults recall as children, but she did find a genetic influence on current religiousness, religious activities, and interests adults have at present. Koenig arrived in Minnesota in 2001 after the data collection had ended, but she said, "I loved hearing Tom's stories about the different pairs and what they were like." She often uses Emza twins Oscar, raised Catholic in Nazi Germany, and Jack, raised Jewish in Trinidad, as a great example of how religious affiliation is environmental and how religious importance can be influenced by genes. There is no gene for religiousness, but the genetic effects on personality and such can influence people's beliefs. The reared-apart twins were a great way to make that point. 32. The rearing home's religious emphasis, parents' education, and other family factors were just not there when it came to social attitudes and religiosity in adulthood. For those who maintained that they were, this situation exemplified what Bouchard called an argument, not evidence. Reading and general intelligence. Wendy Johnson arrived at the University of Minnesota in the fall 2000 as a new graduate student in the Department of Psychology. Bouchard suggested that she work with Matt McGew since Bouchard would soon be retiring. But Bouchard is still here, she told me in October 2009, implying that he enjoyed the MISTRA too much to leave. Johnson earned her PhD in 2005, then worked for Bouchard and McGew as a postdoctoral fellow for a year and a half. As of 2010, she has been a research fellow and reader at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, analyzing cognitive ability data from the Minnesota, United Kingdom samples. Understanding the genetic and environmental structure of intelligence and personality is her passion. Over the years, Johnson and I have co-authored several articles and a chapter using the reared-apart twin data and co-hosted a symposium. But it wasn't until that October day that I heard her reflections on the MISTRA. Johnson said, "I have never met a single reared-apart twin, but I would love to." Bouchard was no longer gathering data in 2000, so Johnson knew the pairs only as identification numbers in computer files. She probably knew the files better than anyone, but working directly with twins might help her answer questions she still wants to address. Is there something special about being a twin that affects behavior? Why do twins recover from low birth weight better than non-twins? Such questions reflect the currently changing behavioral genetics trends, away from estimating heritabilities and toward finding the psychological and biological mechanisms underlying behavior. Johnson was first author on 3 papers that combined tests and inventories within and between the domains of general intelligence, special mental abilities, reading performance, and personality. Her work produced new ideas about the structure of intelligence. One of her first papers concerned the Stroop color word test. The Stroop color word test has been of psychological interest since its introduction in 1935. It is a test of mental attention and flexibility that assesses how well people can inhibit or stop one response to say or do another response. The 1978 version of the Stroop, added to the MISTRA in 1986, presents participants with 3 pages. The first page displays color words, green, red, and blue, printed in black ink. The second page displays rows of 10s printed in various colors, and a third page displays color words printed in different ink colors. For example, the word red would be printed in green. Interference on this test refers to whether a word's meaning, such as red, affects the subject's ability to name the color if it is printed in green. The color word interference score is determined by the number of colors on page 3 that are read aloud correctly in 45 seconds. This score has been hypothesized to reflect individual differences in verbal processing. Interference is greatest during the elementary school years when automaticity, performing an activity using little focused attention, with color words is new, but performance improves over time. Reading skill has also been linked to Stroop test performance, but mostly in younger populations and clinical samples. Other Stroop measures have been studied, such as the word score, number of words on page 1 read aloud correctly, and the color score, number of colors on page 2 read aloud correctly. Only 2 twin studies using the Stroop test were available when Johnson began her analyses. Greater MZT than DZT twin resemblance was found, but the samples were small, and the twins were elderly. Thus, the MISTRA was the first study to consider genetic effects on Stroop test performance in a middle-aged twin sample, and to relate Stroop scores to mental ability, reading, and personality. This was also the first time that data from the 2 reading tests, the Slauson oral reading test and the Woodcock-Johnson reading mastery test, were used. Reading tests were added to the MISTRA in the late 1980s in collaboration with Professor J. Samuels in the Department of Educational Psychology. This work began when Bouchard was hosting a visitor from abroad who wanted to meet Samuels. The 3 met in Elliott Hall, and Samuels asked Bouchard if he had included a reading component in the assessment schedule. In the mid-1980s, there were some tape recordings made of the twins in various settings, but not the more informative tests of word recognition, reading speed, and comprehension that interested Samuels. Tom realized that this was an opportunity to do something. Samuels recalled in the weeks that followed, Samuels and I assembled 3 oral reading passages, a spelling test, and 2 reading tests that were used in educational assessments. According to Samuels, we did it, the reading component, a gorgeous, wonderful way. We chose passages that could be read at advanced high school or college levels. We did not use a multiple choice format. We had the twins read the passages out loud and tell us what they remembered, known as active recall. Doing 2 things at the same time, deciding and comprehending, gets to the issue of reading fluency. Samuels and I also designed a spelling test. We selected 37 words from Dr. Richard Vinesky's computer-generated list that could either be spelled phonetically, for example, department, or had unique letter combinations that were not rule-related, for example, echo. We thus assessed rule mastery and visual memory. Samuels called the data an international gold mine. Johnson made great use of this gold mine to produce her 3 studies. Her paper on genetic and environmental influences and correlates of the Stroop test utilized the Wechsler IQ scores, selected special mental ability tests, and the 2 standard reading tests. It included 50 mesa-twin pairs, 37 DZ twin pairs, as well as twins, spouses, and companions for a total of participants. It remains the largest study of its kind. Genetic influence was found on every Stroop test measure, ranging from 0.35 for interference to 0.50 for words. The Stroop was not developed with the idea of assessing genetic and environmental influences on performance, a feature yielding results that were both unbiased and persuasive. Johnson also found that most of Telligent's personality scales showed little relationship to Stroop performance. This was somewhat surprising because previous studies had shown a relationship between Stroop test performance and impulsivity. Interestingly, the IQ score, most mental ability measures, and the reading test scores were significantly correlated with Stroop test performance. It was possible that the twins' similarities in mental abilities were responsible for the similarities in their Stroop scores. However, the twins' correlations hardly changed when the effects of the mental performance scores were statistically removed. Thus, the different Stroop measures are valid ability constructs in and of themselves. Johnson's interests led her to consider a second problem, is the genetic factor structure, that is the different ability components or dimensions of general intelligence and reading performance, the same for children and adults. This analysis also offered an opportunity to look at the heritabilities of reading and word recognition. In order to maximize the difference between our general intelligence and reading measures, she chose 3 fluid ability tests from the special ability battery pedigrees, flexibility of closure, and induction. These 3 tests reflect abilities that are not closely tied to formal education, whereas reading is a learned skill. The reading measures included the 2 word recognition tests, Slauson and Woodcock, the 3 reading passages, and the spelling test that Samuels and I had assembled. Happily, in 2009 I found old copies of the spelling words and reading passages in my files. In the 1980s and early 1990s, I could almost recite them by heart after having listened to the twins repeat them so many times. The following list includes some of the words and sentences from the spelling tape, exactly as the twins would have heard them. Department. He worked in a department store. Department. Echo. I heard the echo echo. Nuisance. The small noisy child was a nuisance. Nuisance. The person on the tape reading them was Bouchard. Twins were instructed to write each word on an answer sheet once it had been repeated. Twins then read 3 passages aloud and told us everything they remembered about what they had read. The first sentences from each passage are reprinted here to provide a sense of the topics we covered. A medical problem that seems to afflict women more than men is sensitivity to cold. Popular opinion holds that success at work depends upon continually pushing for what you want and refusing to take no for an answer. When researchers first began to study reading, many ideas about its nature were generated from the method of introspection. The twins' scores on the spelling test were the number of words they spelled correctly. Their scores on the reading passages were created by assigning values to the number of different points they presented in each passage during their retelling. Their tape-recorded sessions were rated by independent judges. This approach to reading comprehension relies on active rather than passive recall and is generally equivalent to the more commonly used multiple-choice method. Johnson found that the genetic factor structure of general intelligence and reading performance was the same for adults and for children. A strong relationship between general intelligence and reading performance in these adult twins was also found. Interestingly, the twins' reading comprehension skills were linked to their general intelligence, but not to their reading performance. It could be that, in adulthood, recognizing words does not guarantee text comprehension. Some people can read fluently without grasping the concepts behind what they read. The participants' spelling skills were linked to both their general intelligence and to their reading performance, not surprisingly, as words with both phonetic and non-phonetic letter combinations had been included. Words with non-phonetic letter combinations are harder to spell, so it made sense that the more intelligent, better readers were also better spellers. The heritabilities for the reading measures were higher than those estimated for children in prior studies. 0.21 for spelling to 0.45 for word recognition. Our values were 0.77 for the Slauson, 0.74 for the Woodcock, 0.76 for spelling, and 0.51 for reading comprehension. This was not very surprising because the heritability of general intelligence increases with age, but the relatively high DZA correlations on the Woodcock, MZA 0.72, DZA 0.70, Slauson MZA 0.73, DZA 0.60, and reading comprehension, MZA 0.36, DZA 0.59, were puzzling because DZA Twins are expected to be only half as alike as MZ twins. Of course, higher than expected DZ twin resemblance on some mental ability measures had been observed in the past. None of the possible explanations we could think of, such as assortative mating or selective placement, could be confirmed. These intelligence and reading studies are good examples of how the MISTRA's rich data files enabled many types of analyses, over and beyond the heritability studies. In contrast, the investigators of the 3 early reared-apart twin studies focused mostly on the twins' behavioral similarities and dissimilarities. This observation is not intended to detract from the contributions made by these early studies. Clearly, the breadth and diversity of their tests were less than those of the MISTRA, and the sophisticated quantitative methods that allow genetic and environmental dissection of measured traits were unavailable. The MISTRA was able to explore many avenues of inquiry because of its comprehensiveness. Here is another example, also from Johnson's work. The conclusion of her third article is stated in its captivating title, Just 1G44. Johnson's third analysis addressed continuing controversies within psychology, namely the identification of a general intelligence factor called G and its measurement. Since the beginning of the modern mental testing movement in 1905 with French investigators Binet and Simon, researchers have debated the evidence for a general intelligence factor versus separate mental abilities as well as the best methods for intellectual assessment. General intelligence, or G, refers to a shared factor that underlies human abilities and explains why tests of different skills, for example, vocabulary and comprehension, are correlated. Competing models recognize separate abilities or talents that function independently or somewhat independently. The MISTRA investigators reasoned that finding similar G factors based on different clusters of mental ability tests would demonstrate that there is, in fact, just one G. 3 different mental ability batteries had been completed by the 436 MISTRA twins, spouses, and others, the Wechsler IQ test, the Hawaii Ability Battery, and the Comprehensive Ability Battery. Here, the twins were treated as separate individuals without reference to their relatedness. In a combined analysis, the 3 G factors correlated highly, ranging from 0.99 to 1, values that are rarely seen in psychological research. Based on this finding, there appears to be a single G. Of course, this G does not capture the full range of abilities, nor does it pinpoint the biological processes underlying human intellect. But the findings made a strong case for including G in future models of intelligence. According to Johnson, these results provide the most substantive evidence of which we are aware that psychological assessments of mental ability are consistently identifying a common component of general intelligence. 49 Bouchard worded this conclusion more forcefully in his 2009 paper, asserting that the previously widespread belief that different intelligence tests yield estimates of quite different intelligences is simply false. 50%. Johnson and Bouchard used the twins' and spouses' mental ability data to probe the structure of human intelligence in other ways. They compared the fit of the data to the 3 extant major intelligence models, the Cattell-Horn fluid crystallized model, the Vernon verbal perceptual model, and the Carroll 3 strata model. This was one of the few MISTRA analyses that specified a hypothesis at the outset. The Vernon model was expected to fit the data best. Beyond that, the work was exploratory in nature, although it generated other hypotheses. Bouchard waited years to do this analysis. Statistical techniques were too rudimentary when the study began, and the sample needed to grow. The Cattell-Horn model recognizes 2 types of intelligence: crystallized, the intelligence acquired from learning and culture, and fluid, the genetically based capacities unrelated to experience. The Vernon model recognizes a general intelligence factor and 2 main ability groupings: verbal, educational, and special, practical, mechanical. The Carroll model includes a general intelligence factor, broadly specialized abilities, and narrowly specialized abilities that relate to a specific domain in the second group. As expected, the Vernon model fit the MISTRA data best, although Johnson and Bouchard enhanced it by adding memory and image rotation factors. They called it, appropriately, the verbal perceptual image rotation model, noting its consistency with the idea of coordinated function across brain regions and the importance of brain laterality. specialization of mental function across the brain's left and right hemispheres in mental performance. The G factor contributed substantially to the verbal, perceptual, and image rotation components, which then contributed to 8 more specialized skills: verbal, scholastic, fluency, number, content memory, perceptual speed, spatial, and rotation. More will be said about this model in the next chapter. Johnson replicated this model in a 2005 study using Thurstone and Thurstone's 1941 data from 710 Chicago schoolchildren. She replicated it again in 2007 using a battery of 46 tests available for 500 professional seamen from the Royal Dutch Navy, and she did once more in 2008 using a different 5-test battery and sample. The Mistra twins had launched a continuing research program. It was usually the other way around, with the Mistra testing new methods and findings with the twins. Tony Vernon, professor of psychology at the University of Western Ontario in London, Canada, is an expert in the study of intelligence and editor of the journal Personality and Individual Differences. According to Vernon, the verbal perceptual image rotation model is the first new model of the structure of intelligence to come along in a long time. It showed itself to be a better fit to the data than Thurstone or Cattell or P.E. Vernon, though it was mostly closely aligned with the Vernon model. 55. I never thought I would say this, but the fact that the original G findings on the model were based largely on reared-apart twin data was inconsequential. Data from good non-twin samples could have and have accomplished the same thing. Johnson made an interesting point as we ended our interview. Unlike many other Mistra colleagues, she said Bouchard may have compromised the scientific rigor of the study by publicizing the EMSA twins' unusual similarities. You don't need quirky stuff. It does not establish anything about behavior. The anecdotes gave detractors something to attack. You need to show striking observations more systematically. Of course, I say this now with 2020's vision of hindsight, which Bouchard could not have had at that time. Johnson referenced a group picture of identical twins, in which the children's hands are positioned similarly within pairs, but differently between pairs. It appears in a 1982 introductory genetics textbook by the late geneticist Edward Nowitzki. Some people might claim that the twins in the picture simply followed the photographer's instructions regarding their hand placement, but the similarities were mostly within the pairs. One might also suggest that each pair's parents had instructed them on how to hold their hands when they were being photographed. However, Johnson speculates that while we are all socialized to fit into our environments, no one instructs us on how to hold our hands. Of course, we really don't know what the twin children were told to do. But as Bouchard said in his last lecture, observing similar hand postures in meso-twin pairs is the best answer to objections that hand-holding is a learned behavior. That answer is shown in Figure 12-1. Meaningful information is stored within each pair's signature habits. But contrary to Johnson, one could argue that it was appropriate for Bouchard to discuss these habits publicly. Rare similarities between meso-twins are provocative, suggesting genetic effects, possibly emergenic in nature. The fact that the same physical and behavioral quirks are more often found in MZ than DZ twin pairs suggests, but does not prove that genetic influence is at work, providing a rationale for further study. It is also the case that the EMSA twins' unusual observations were not publicized exclusively by Bouchard. Comment. The Association for Psychological Science publishes a slim journal called Current Directions in Psychological Science. Articles appear on a mostly invitation-only basis, although interested contributors can bring potential topics to the editor's attention. In a 2004 article, Bouchard identified several key trends and big questions. He noted that behavior geneticists had always assumed that genetic influence would vary from trait to trait, and that behaviors such as social attitudes would show little heritability. But the two recent surprises have been the generally moderate level of genetic influence across most traits. According to Bouchard, it seems reasonable to suspect that moderate heritability may be a general biological phenomenon rather than one specific to human psychological traits, as the profile of genetic and environmental influences on psychological traits is not that different from the profile of these influences on similarly complex physical traits, and similar findings apply to most organisms. 58. Figure 12-1. 5 mesotwin pairs shown with CBS host Leslie Stahl on the set of 48 Hours, November 15, 2003. Note the similar hand and leg positions of the twins seated in the front row. The male twins to the left and the female twins in the center of the second row did not participate in the MISTRA. Photo credit John P. Philo, CBS News. Bouchard also asserted that the name of the field behavior genetics is an unfortunate misnomer. His studies are neutral with respect to genetic and environmental influences. Now that the heritabilities of most traits have been established, interest in uncovering the underlying molecular and environmental mechanisms is paramount.